Why this deal is dead without a translator. The billionaire's voice was like the clink of ice in an empty glass, sharp and cold. He sneered at the line of impeccably dressed executives cowering before him. No one imagined that the quiet waitress refilling his water glass held the key not only to his billion-dollar empire, but to a secret that would shatter his gilded world to its very foundations. The boardroom of Sterling Industries was less a room and more a declaration of war against the sky. Perched on the 92nd floor, its glass walls framed the sprawling city below, transforming cars into blood cells flowing through concrete arteries and people into insignificant specks. The air inside was chilled and sterile, smelling of expensive leather and the faint, metallic scent of ambition. A single slab of obsidian, polished to a mirror finish, served as a table, reflecting the strained faces of the men and women seated around it like distorted, funereal masks. Every surface gleamed with a cold, unforgiving light, from the chrome legs of the chairs to the crystal water pitchers that seemed to sweat diamonds. At the head of this frozen altar sat Alistair Sterling. He was a man carved from the same expensive, unyielding material as his surroundings. His suit, a shade of charcoal so dark it seemed to absorb the light, was tailored with geometric precision. On his wrist, a Patek Philippe watch, a universe of gears and complications, ticked away seconds that were worth more than most people's entire lives. His face was a study in controlled contempt. His silver hair was combed back with a severity that allowed no strand to fall out of place, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the room not for people, but for weaknesses. To Alistair, the world was a simple equation. There were assets, and there were liabilities. People were merely variables to be manipulated or discarded. Right now, everyone in this room was a liability. He felt a familiar surge of disgust. He had built this empire from the grit of his own poverty, clawing his way up a ladder whose rungs were made of the bones of his competitors. He had sacrificed everything, family, love, peace, for the inviolable security of wealth. Money was a fortress, and he was its king. But today, the walls of his fortress were being breached by the one thing he could not buy: understanding. The deal on the table, a monumental energy partnership with Sheikh Khalid bin Rashid Al Maktoum, was worth billions. It was a legacy project. And it was collapsing because the high-priced translator he had hired could not comprehend the Sheikh's rare Bedouin dialect. It was, to Alistair's ears, just noise, incomprehensible, frustrating noise that was costing him a fortune. Almost invisible against the panorama of the city, a young woman moved with quiet efficiency. Her name was Ilara, and she was a ghost in this machine of power. Her simple black uniform, provided by the catering company, was neat and anonymous, designed to help her blend into the background. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face, often cast downwards, was pale and carried the subtle weariness of someone who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. She refilled water glasses with a practiced grace, her movements economical and silent. She was background noise, a necessary but unnoticed function of this opulent world. But inside Ilara, a universe of memories churned. The scent of the Sheikh's oud perfume, faint but distinct, was a key that unlocked a door to a life she kept buried deep within her. It smelled of desert nights and her father's study, of ancient books and stories told in a language as rich and textured as a woven carpet. A language that was now being butchered by the sweating, frantic translator at the far end of the table. Each mispronounced word, each fumbled phrase, was a small sacrilege against the memory of her family, her home, her entire world, which had been turned to dust and whispers. She felt the familiar ache of loss, a phantom limb that throbbed with the rhythm of her heart. The central object of this entire affair, the focal point of all this tension, lay on the obsidian table. It was a contract, bound in deep blue leather and embossed with the sterling crest and the Sheikh's royal seal. Its pages, filled with dense legal jargon, were meaningless without the verbal agreement, the trust that could only be forged through a shared tongue. That document represented two different kinds of power. Alistair's, which was new, hard, and measured in market shares, and the Sheikh's, which was ancient, nuanced, and measured in honor. It was a bridge between worlds that was currently on fire. The Sheikh, a man whose quiet dignity seemed to absorb the room's frantic energy, finally raised a hand. He spoke a few soft words in his native tongue. The translator, a man named Mr. Jennings, who was paid an exorbitant fee, paled. He stammered, wiped his brow with a silk handkerchief, and looked at Alistair with pleading eyes. What did he say? Alistair's voice was a low growl. Mr. Sterling, I believe he is expressing his disappointment, Jennings faltered. The dialect is highly archaic. It's not standard. Alistair's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. Disappointment? I am paying you a king's ransom to be a dictionary, not to tell me he's disappointed. Translate him. The Sheikh spoke again, his tone still even but with an edge as sharp as a scimitar. This time, he looked directly at Alistair. Jennings wilted completely. He says honor cannot be bought, and a man who does not understand his words cannot be trusted with his resources. He says the conversation is over. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a billion-dollar deal evaporating into the sterile, conditioned air. Alistair Sterling felt a fury so pure, it was almost calming. It was the rage of a king whose decrees were being ignored. He had spent 6 months cultivating this deal, greasing palms, leveraging political connections, and outmaneuvering rivals. To have it all fall apart because of a linguistic failure was an insult of the highest order. It was a flaw in the perfect machine he had constructed. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements radiating a lethal menace. His gaze swept over his board members, who shrank under his glare, then over the hapless translator. And finally, it landed on the service staff huddled by the door, waiting to clear the remnants of a meeting that had just died. His eyes, cold and dismissive, snagged on Alara as she carefully placed a fresh bottle of water on the credenza. She was just another piece of furniture, another faceless drone in his world. But this is a disgrace, Alistair announced to the room, his voice dangerously low. He pointed a finger at Jennings. You are fired. Get out of my building. Then, his anger, needing a new target, swiveled towards the staff. His cruelty was a performance, a way to reassert his dominance in a moment of failure. This entire city, he spat, is filled with incompetence. He turned his sneer on Alara, who had frozen at the venom in his tone. He saw her simple uniform, her worn but clean shoes, her lack of jewelry. She was the embodiment of everything he had fought to escape: powerlessness, anonymity, poverty. She was a perfect target for the poison churning in his gut. What about you? He said, a cruel laugh coloring his words. The entire room, the Sheikh's delegation, his own executives, was now a captive audience to his tirade. Can you translate for the Sheikh? Do you speak his ancient, important language? Alara stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt the weight of every eye in the room. Of course you can't, Alistair continued, enjoying her discomfort. He took a step towards her, invading her space. "You're here to pour water, to be silent and invisible. That's what you're paid for." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick money clip, peeling off a single $100 bill. He held it out between two fingers, as if offering a treat to a dog. The gesture was designed for maximum humiliation. "Here," he said loudly, "a tip for your excellent silent service. Perhaps you can buy a dictionary with it." The room was thick with a horrified fascination. Some of his junior executives chuckled nervously, eager to align themselves with his power. The Sheikh, however, watched the exchange with an unreadable expression, his dark eyes missing nothing. The air crackled with Ilara's shame. It was a raw, public stripping of her dignity. But then Alistair, swept up in his own theatrical cruelty, decided to raise the stakes. He wanted to make an unforgettable point about the worthlessness of the common person. "I'll tell you what," he declared, his voice booming in the acoustically perfect room. He gestured grandly towards the Sheikh. "Forget the 100. I will give $10,000, cash, right now, to anyone in this room who is not on my executive board who can tell me what our honored guest is thinking." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound with no warmth. $10,000 for a single sentence. "Any takers? You?" He sneered at Ilara. "A year's salary for you, I imagine?" The challenge hung in the air, grotesque and impossible. It was a game only he could win, a performance designed to underscore his power and everyone else's impotence. The crowd of onlookers was now fully complicit, their silence a form of applause. They watched Ilara, expecting her to scurry away, crushed and humiliated. For a long moment, Ilara did nothing. She stood rooted to the spot, the heat of shame crawling up her neck. Alistair's words echoed in her mind. Not just his, but the words of all the people who had ever dismissed her, overlooked her, treated her as less than human since she had lost everything. The years of quiet endurance, of swallowing her pride to survive, pressed down on her. She could feel the ghost of her father's hand on her shoulder, could hear his voice whispering an old proverb from their homeland. "A sword that stays in its sheath is still a sword." Something inside her shifted. It was not a snap, but a slow, deliberate turning of a heavy key in a rusted lock. The fear did not vanish, but it was suddenly outweighed by a profound, bone-deep weariness of being invisible. She looked past Alistair's mocking face and met the Sheikh's steady, waiting gaze. In his eyes, she saw not the exotic caricature Alistair saw, but a man from her part of the world, a man who understood the weight of heritage. She saw a flicker of shared history. She took a small, deliberate breath. She accepted the challenge. Ignoring Alistair completely, Ilara took 2 steps forward, her posture straightening. The timid waitress seemed to recede, replaced by someone else, someone with an ancient poise. She inclined her head respectfully towards the Sheikh and began to speak. The words that left her lips were not the clumsy, academic Arabic of the failed translator. They were liquid and lyrical, flowing with the cadence of poetry and the precision of a scholar. She spoke in the Sheikh's rare dialect, a language of sand and stars, of honor and subtle meaning, a tongue that was said to hold the soul of the desert itself. She said in that near-forgotten tongue, "Forgive the discourtesy of this house, noble Sheikh. The wind howls loudest in empty canyons, and a man's wealth is not always a measure of his wisdom." The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The entire room fell into a silence so profound, it felt as if the air had been sucked out. The nervous shuffling, the quiet coughs, the ticking of Alistair's watch. it all ceased. The sheikh, who had been impassive and remote, sat bolt upright. His eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in astonishment, and finally in a dawning, profound respect. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine expression of wonder that transformed his stern features. Alistair Sterling stood frozen, the $10,000 challenge forgotten, the money clip still in his hand. His mind, a finely tuned machine for calculating profit and loss, simply could not process the data it was receiving. The world had inverted its axis. The waitress, the non-entity, the piece of background scenery, was speaking a language his high-priced expert could not. And she was not just speaking it. She was wielding it like a master swordsman. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift. It shattered and reformed in an instant. The sheikh responded to her, his own voice now warm and engaged. He ignored everyone else, his entire focus on Ilara. He asked her a question, a complex and poetic inquiry about her origins. Without hesitation, Ilara replied, weaving a traditional saying into her answer. I am a daughter of the Al-Jamil tribe, from the shadow of the Jebel Akhdar Mountains. We drink from the well of memory, even when the oasis has run dry. The sheikh's smile widened. He clapped his hands together once, a sharp, decisive sound that broke the spell. He spoke again, this time a direct command. Ilara turned her gaze to Alistair for the first time since she had spoken. Her eyes were no longer downcast. They were clear, steady, and held a depth of sorrow and strength that he had never noticed before. The power had inverted so completely that she was now the arbiter of his fate. The sheikh, she said, her voice quiet, but ringing with an authority that eclipsed Alistair's shouting, wishes to continue the negotiations. However, he will do so only with me as the translator. He says he will not speak to you directly again. He will speak only to the daughter of the Al-Jamil. Alistair stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. His face, usually a mask of arrogant control, was now a canvas of raw, unfiltered shock. The smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. He was no longer the king in his castle. He was a foreigner in his own boardroom. The woman he had tried to humiliate for sport now held his legacy in the palm of her hand. The silence from his board members was no longer one of fear of him, but of awe for her. The fallout was immediate and devastating to Alistair's ego. For the next 2 hours, he was forced to sit at the head of his own table in utter silence, a powerless spectator to his own triumph. Ilara stood beside the sheikh, a figure of serene competence. She moved between the two languages with an effortless grace, but she did more than translate words. She translated meaning, culture, and intent. She anticipated the sheikh's concerns, clarified legal clauses with nuanced cultural analogies, and bridged the gap between his world of ancient honor and Alistair's world of cold commerce. She was not a conduit. She was a diplomat. The deal was saved. In fact, it was improved. The sheikh, clearly impressed and feeling a kinship with Ilara, offered more favorable terms than Alistair had ever dared to hope for. He saw in her a reflection of the values he held dear: respect, heritage, and dignity. And he was rewarding her, not Alistair. With the final terms agreed upon, the sheikh rose. His entourage followed suit. He walked directly to Ilara, bypassing Alistair as if he were a ghost. He took her hand gently. "Your father would be proud," he said in their shared tongue. The knowledge of the Al-Jamil was thought to be lost to the wind. "You are a treasure, child. A treasure more valuable than all the oil beneath the sand." Then, Switching to perfect, crisp English for the benefit of the entire room, he made his final pronouncement. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice carrying the weight of royal decree, "this partnership is contingent upon one new condition. Mademoiselle Ilara will be appointed as the official liaison for my interests in this project. Her compensation will be drawn directly from your company's profits, at a level befitting her unique and invaluable skills. I will have my lawyers draft the specifics. If you refuse, the deal is off." Before Alistair could even respond, the Sheikh and his delegation swept out of the room, leaving behind a silence thick with the wreckage of Alistair's authority. His board members stared, not at him, but at Ilara. They were looking at the new center of power. The woman who had been serving them coffee 30 minutes ago was now their superior in the most important deal in the company's history. Alistair finally found his voice. It was a strangled, disbelieving whisper. "Who are you?" he asked, the question directed at Ilara. It was not a demand, but a plea. He needed to understand the cataclysm that had just occurred. But Ilara did not answer him. She simply met his gaze, holding it for a long moment, before turning to gather her few belongings from a staff locker. She had nothing to say to him. Her actions had spoken for her. Alistair Sterling was left alone in the silent monument to his power, utterly and completely defeated by a ghost he had never even seen. The foundation of his world, the belief that money could buy anything, had been fractured beyond repair. The days that followed were a surreal torment for Alistair. He was a king in exile within his own kingdom. The news of the miracle translator spread through the company like wildfire. Ilara was given a corner office on the executive floor, her simple waitress uniform replaced by modest but elegant business attire. She was quiet, dignified, and terrifyingly competent. She spoke only when necessary, but her words carried the weight of the Sheikh's full authority. Alistair's executives, who once feared him, now treated her with a reverent deference. Alistair tried to reassert control. He called a meeting to review the project, but it became clear within minutes that Ilara understood the cultural and logistical intricacies far better than his own team. He tried to intimidate her, summoning her to his vast, imposing office. She entered not with the fear he expected, but with a calm self-possession that infuriated him. "I need to know who you are," he demanded, his voice tight. "Where did you come from? Where did you learn to speak like that?" "I learned it in my home," she replied simply, her voice even. "It was the language my father taught me." "And where is your home?" he pressed, searching for a weakness, a pressure point. "It is no longer on any map," she said, a flicker of profound sadness crossing her features for a moment. "It exists now only in memory." Her composure was a wall he could not breach. His usual tactics, threats, condescension, the sheer weight of his wealth, were useless against her. She wanted nothing from him, and that made her invincible. He was a man whose only weapon was a hammer, and she was made of water. Driven by a desperate need to understand the source of her power over him, Alistair did what he did best. He deployed his resources. He hired the most ruthless private investigators money could buy. "I want to know everything about her," he commanded. "Her family, her education, where she was born, what she had for breakfast, everything." He needed to find a flaw, a secret, something he could use to tear down this inexplicable edifice of dignity she had built in the heart of his empire. While the investigators dug into her past, Alistair was forced into a private, emotionally charged confrontation. The Sheikh, as part of their new arrangement, had requested a formal dinner to celebrate the partnership, and he had insisted that it be an intimate affair at a neutral location, a quiet, elegant restaurant. He specified only 3 attendees: himself, Alistair, and Alara. The dinner was excruciating. The Sheikh and Alara conversed easily in their shared tongue, their conversation flowing with warmth and shared cultural references. Alistair sat in silence, an awkward and irrelevant third wheel. He felt like a child at the adults' table, unable to comprehend the world they inhabited. They were not discussing business. They were sharing stories, reciting poetry, and speaking of history. He was entirely excluded. The powerlessness was a physical agony, a grinding humiliation far worse than the one he had inflicted on her. Finally, the Sheikh turned to him, speaking in English. "Mr. Sterling, Ilara has been telling me about her father. He was a great man, a scholar and a poet. He collected and transcribed the oral histories of our people, preserving a heritage that was fading. The world suffered a great loss when he was killed." Alistair saw his opening. "How was he killed?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, masking the predatory intent. Ilara's face became a mask of controlled grief. "There was a conflict in my region," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Foreign corporate interests wanted the land. They funded mercenaries to create instability. My village was caught in the middle. It was burned. My family, they did not survive." She reached into her small handbag and pulled out a worn, folded photograph, its edges soft with time. She slid it across the table. It showed a kind-faced, bearded man with intelligent eyes, standing before a wall of books. Beside him stood a young girl with the same dark, serious eyes as the woman sitting before him now. "That was my father," she said. "His name was Yusuf al-Jamil." Alistair looked at the photograph, and a strange sense of unease prickled his skin. The name, the region, it tickled a remote corner of his memory, a transaction from long ago, back when he was hungrier and more ruthless. A detail he had long since buried under a mountain of profitable acquisitions. The next morning, the preliminary report from his investigators landed on his desk. It was a slim file. Ilara had no official records before the age of 16, when she had appeared in a refugee camp in Turkey. Her identity had been established through aid workers. The file contained a single place name: the village of Wadi al-Nur. Wadi al-Nur. The name hit Alistair like a physical blow. He stumbled back from his desk, a cold dread creeping up his spine. He strode to his private archives, a climate-controlled vault where the paper trails of his corporate conquests were stored. His hands trembled as he keyed in the access code. He found the records for one of his earliest and most hostile takeovers, a small, aggressive oil exploration company called Scorpion Mineral Resources. He had bought them for a pittance and poured money into their operations, demanding results at any cost. He never visited the sites. He only read the profit reports. He remembered a line item from a quarterly statement from that era: pacification and site security. It was a euphemism, a sterile corporate term for the brutal work of clearing land of inconvenient local populations. His fingers flew across the keyboard of the archive terminal. He cross-referenced the operational reports from Scorpion with the date of the conflict Ilara had mentioned. And there it was, an internal memo written by the mercenary commander on Scorpion's payroll. It detailed the successful clearing of a recalcitrant village that was resisting their exploratory drilling. The village's name was Wadi al-Nur. The report praised the efficiency of the operation. It mentioned neutralizing the local elder, a troublemaker who was trying to rally opposition. His name was Yusuf al-Jamil. The air left Alistair's lungs. The entire 92-story skyscraper seemed to tilt on its axis. The fated connection, the hideous karmic irony of it all, crashed down upon him with the force of a physical collapse. He was not just a man who had insulted a waitress. He was the architect of her entire tragedy. His ambition, his relentless blind pursuit of profit, had signed the death warrant for her family. The money he had used to build this very office, this very empire, was stained with the blood of the man in the photograph. The ghost he had tried to humiliate was the living embodiment of his oldest, most foundational sin. He stared at his own reflection in the polished obsidian of his desk, but he did not recognize the man staring back. The king in the fortress was a monster, and the walls he had built to keep the world out had only served to trap him inside with his own guilt. The foundation of his life was not made of steel and concrete, but of the ashes of a small village and the bones of a poet. The revelation broke Alistair Sterling. It was not a gradual erosion, but an instantaneous shattering, like a crystal goblet dropped onto marble. The intricate machinery of his arrogance, his ambition, his entire worldview seized up and then collapsed into a heap of rubble. For 2 days, he did not leave his office. He sat in the dark, the lights of the city he owned mocking him through the glass walls. He replayed the scene in the boardroom, his own sneering voice, the casual cruelty of his gesture with the $100 bill. He saw it now for what it was, the monstrous pride of a murderer taunting the orphan he had created. He was haunted by the face of Yusuf al-Jamil in the photograph. The man's kind, scholarly eyes seemed to follow him, not with accusation, but with a deep, bottomless sorrow. He thought of Ilara, of the quiet, unshakable dignity she possessed. It was not the dignity of defiance. It was the dignity of survival. She had walked through the fire that he had paid to set, and had emerged not consumed by hatred, but forged into something stronger than he could ever be. His wealth was a shield. Her pain was a crucible. Stripped of his pride, all that remained was the hollow, aching core of his own past. He remembered the gnawing hunger of his childhood, the shame of his father's failures, the cold terror of being powerless. He had spent his entire life running from that boy, building a fortress of gold and steel to protect him. But in trying to kill the frightened boy inside him, he had become a tyrant who created that same fear in others, on a scale he had never allowed himself to comprehend. He knew he was at a crossroads. He could deny it, bury the files, and fire Ilara. He had the power to erase her, to silence the truth. Or he could face the abyss he had opened. He could choose ruin, or he could choose atonement. For the first time in his life, the choice had nothing to do with profit or loss. It had to do with the sliver of a soul he wasn't sure he still possessed. On the 3rd day, he summoned Ilara to his office. When she entered, she found him not behind his massive desk, but standing by the window, looking out at the city. He looked smaller, diminished. The razor-sharp edges of his persona had been worn away, leaving a man who looked old and profoundly tired. "I know what happened," he said, his voice hoarse. He did not turn to face her. "To your village, to your father. I know it was my company." Ilara stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. She simply waited. "The Scorpion Mineral Resources acquisition," he continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It was one of my first. I was hungry. I didn't ask questions. I just looked at the numbers. Pacification. That's what they called it. I never let myself think about what that word meant." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes, once so cold and commanding, were filled with a terrible, broken shame. There are no words to, I can't apologize. An apology is an insult. It's a fly trying to stop a tidal wave. What I did, it is unforgivable. He walked to his desk and slid a single folder across its polished surface. This is everything. The original files, the memos, the payment records to the mercenaries. Everything you would need to destroy me. It is yours. Ilara looked at the folder, then back at him. What do you want me to do with it? She asked, her voice quiet. I want you to choose, he said. Ruin me. Take it to the press, to the authorities. I won't fight it. It's a punishment I've earned 1,000 times over. This was his choice, his first step on a path he could not yet see. He was surrendering his power, not as a tactic, but as an act of penance. Ilara walked to the desk, but she did not pick up the folder. Ruin is too easy, she said, her voice gaining a strength he had not heard before. It ends the story. My father taught me that true justice is not about tearing down, but about building up. He believed that knowledge, once lost, could be reclaimed, that a desert, once barren, could be made to bloom again. Alistair stared at her, uncomprehending. What does that mean? It means that if you truly want to atone, she said, her eyes boring into his, you will not fall on your sword. You will pick up a shovel. You will help me rebuild what you tore down. In that moment, she offered him not forgiveness, but a purpose, a path to redemption that was far more difficult and far more meaningful than simple destruction. The grand gesture that followed was not a single act, but the complete reorientation of Alistair Sterling's life and fortune. Guided by Ilara and with the full backing of Sheikh Khalid, he began the arduous process of atonement. His first act was to publicly dissolve Scorpion Mineral Resources and all its subsidiaries, confessing to the company's history of brutal exploitation. The financial world was stunned. His stock plummeted. His board tried to oust him, but he was relentless. He sold off his private jets, his yachts, his multiple mansions. He liquidated assets that were once the symbols of his power, converting them into capital for his new purpose. He established the Al-Jamil Foundation for Heritage and Hope, endowing it with billions of dollars, the entirety of the profit he had ever made from his energy sector ventures. Its mission was twofold: to provide aid and education to refugees displaced by corporate-funded conflicts, and to fund cultural preservation projects to reclaim the languages, histories, and traditions that had been targeted for erasure. He insisted that the Foundation's board be headed by one person, Ilara. He gave her complete and autonomous control over the vast resources he had placed at her disposal. It was his ultimate act of surrender, placing his legacy, his fortune, and his chance at redemption entirely in the hands of the woman whose life he had destroyed. She was no longer just a liaison. She was the architect of his penance, the empowered and vindicated leader of an organization dedicated to healing the very wounds he had inflicted. A few years passed. The world of high finance largely forgot about the disgraced tycoon Alistair Sterling, who had seemingly vanished after dismantling a significant portion of his own empire. But in a remote mountainous region, once scarred by conflict, a new story was taking root. The village of Wadi al-Nur had been rebuilt. It was not a replica of the old village, but something new, vibrant, and forward-looking. At its heart stood the Yusuf al-Jamil Center for Living History, a beautiful structure of local stone and glass that housed a library, a school, and a community archive. Its funding was a quiet, constant stream from the foundation. Inside, the sound of children's voices filled the air, as they learned to read and write in the ancient dialect of their ancestors, the very language that had once saved a $1 billion deal and brought a tyrant to his knees. Ilara, now in her early 30s, moved through the center with an aura of quiet authority and deep peace. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's world. She was the respected guardian of her own. She wore traditional robes, her hair uncovered, and her face held the calm wisdom of someone who had navigated unimaginable loss and found a way to build a future from its ashes. One afternoon, she was in the library, watching a group of teenagers digitally archiving old poems recited by the community's last surviving elder. A man with silver hair and dressed in simple, functional work clothes was carefully cataloging a new shipment of books. He moved with a quiet humility, his hands, which had once signed orders that leveled villages, now dusty with the residue of paper and ink. It was Alistair Sterling. He worked here as a volunteer, a quiet and anonymous figure. He had found that the only way to quiet the ghosts of his past was to engage in the tangible, humble work of rebuilding. He sought no recognition, no praise. His penance was his purpose. He walked over to Ilara, holding up a newly published volume. "The first edition of the Oral Histories is ready," he said, his voice soft. "Your father's work, finally complete." Ilara took the book, its cover bearing the name of Yusuf al-Jamil. She ran her hand over his name, her expression one of poignant, cathartic love. "He would have liked this," she said. "He always said a book was a garden you could carry in your pocket." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out the window at the thriving village, at the children playing in the new schoolyard. The world he had broken, she had remade, and he, in turn, was being remade by it. "Thank you, Ilara," he said, the words carrying the weight of years of unspoken gratitude, "for not destroying me." She turned to him, her eyes clear and full of a grace he knew he would never deserve. "Destruction is the tool of the powerful, Alistair. Healing is the work of the strong," she said. "My father is not here because of what you did. But this place, these children, this language breathing again, they are here because of what we did together. Forgiveness is not about forgetting the debt. It is about building something so beautiful that it finally outweighs it." The story concluded not with a dramatic flourish, but with this quiet moment of shared humanity. The final tableau was not of a vanquished villain and a triumphant hero, but of two broken people who had found a way to piece together a better world from the shards of their shared, tragic history. The moral of their story was written in the stone of the new school and spoken in the ancient dialect of the children. It was a clear and simple lesson that echoed through the rebuilt canyon. That true wealth is not what you accumulate for yourself, but what you help to restore for others. It is measured not in stock prices or corporate power, but in the quiet, priceless currency of kindness, second chances, and the enduring power of a human soul to choose creation over destruction.